For 20 years, a Russian couple spied on the White House. They lived 5 miles from the Oval Office, and a single mailbox key would destroy everything they'd built. Picture this. Georgetown, 1969. Joy Ann Balch is teaching piano to an admiral's daughter. Her husband Robert translates documents for European embassies. Their teenage daughter Nina just got accepted to Georgetown University. They host 4th of July barbecues. They sing in the church choir. Every neighbor trusts them completely. But behind their bedroom dresser, taped to a family photo, is a sheet of rice paper with radio frequencies connecting them directly to Moscow. Every Thursday, while Nina practices ballet, Joy Ann services dead drops in Georgetown alleys. For 2 decades, they've stolen 10,000 pages of America's secrets, not from classified files, but from dinner parties, church potlucks, and the innocent confessions of lonely government wives. Then one March afternoon, their daughter collapses at school. Joy Ann rushes to the hospital, grabbing the wrong purse, the one with the mailbox key. Their elderly neighbor, trying to help, discovers their music box. Inside it, she finds something that will unravel 20 years of deception. Because in the world of espionage, it's not the grand betrayals that destroy you. It's the tiny mistakes, the rushed moments, the misplaced keys that unlock more than just mailboxes. They unlock the terrible truth about who we really are when no one's watching. Where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more buried Cold War stories, the human truths hidden in classified archives, subscribe now. Because every day, we open doors to the shadow world that shaped our history. Now, let's return to Prague, 1948, where a young American student is about to meet the Soviet spy who will become her husband, her handler, and ultimately, her downfall. Prague's cobblestones were still wet from the morning rain when Joy Ann Miller first saw him. It was September 1948, and the city had that particular heaviness that comes after a revolution. Not quite defeated, not quite reborn, suspended between what was and what might be. She'd come to study Kafka and Kundera, to understand how literature survives under oppression. She was 22, from Bloomington, Indiana. And she believed, truly believed, that art could bridge the growing divide between East and West. The jazz club near Wenceslas Square wasn't on any tourist map. She'd found it by following the sound of a saxophone through the narrow streets, drawn by something familiar in a city that felt increasingly foreign. Inside, through cigarette smoke that hung like morning fog, she watched Czech students dance with a desperation that Americans couldn't understand. Not yet. They danced like people storing up joy for a coming winter. He approached during a break between sets. Not aggressively, not with the swagger of Soviet officers who'd begun appearing in Prague's nightlife. He simply appeared at her table with 2 glasses of Becherovka and asked, in accented but precise English, if she'd like to discuss the book she was reading. She'd been studying Čapek's War with the Newts, a Czech satire about humanity's capacity for self-destruction that felt prophetic in 1948. "You're reading it in Czech," he observed. "Most Americans would use a translation." "Most Americans aren't trying to understand what's happening here," Joy Ann replied. His name, he said, was Robert Balch, a graduate student in linguistics, originally from the Sudetenland, that contested borderland where German and Czech identities blurred into something neither and both. His family had fled when the Soviets arrived. Now he survived by teaching Russian to Czech officials who needed to speak the new language of power, and teaching Czech to Soviet administrators who needed to understand what they'd conquered. What Joy Ann didn't know, couldn't know, was that Robert Balch had died of typhus in a Soviet transit camp 2 years earlier. The man sitting across from her was Viktor Sokolov, 28, trained at the KGB's School No. 101 outside Moscow, where they taught their illegals not just to speak perfect English, but to dream in it. His legend, as they called manufactured identities, had been crafted from a real person's interrupted life, the best kind of lie, because it was built on truth. They talked until the club closed, then walked along the Vltava as dawn painted the castle gold. He quoted Mayakovsky and Whitman with equal passion. He spoke of a world where nuclear weapons would make war impossible, where mutual understanding would replace mutual destruction. Joy Ann had heard such idealism from her progressive friends at Indiana University, but never with such conviction, such personal cost. Here was someone who'd lost everything to war, and still believed in peace. 6 weeks later, when he proposed in the Petrine Gardens with a ring he claimed was his grandmother's, Joy Ann said yes immediately. The Spied didn't trouble her. War had taught everyone that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. When he suggested they marry quickly and emigrate to America, she saw it as rescue, not infiltration. Her parents in Bloomington would be thrilled she was saving a refugee from communist oppression. The ceremony at the American embassy was small. The cultural attaché who served as witness would later testify he noticed nothing unusual, though he did remember thinking the groom seemed older than his stated 25 years. The bride wore a blue dress she'd bought at a Prague department store. The groom wore a suit that was check in cut, but somehow suggested other places, other identities barely concealed. On their wedding night, in a small hotel near the embassy, Victor performed the most difficult role of his life, that of a young husband genuinely in love. The terrifying truth was that it required no performance at all. Somewhere between the jazz club and the altar, between his mission and his heart, something real had taken root. Moscow had trained him to seduce American women for intelligence purposes. They hadn't trained him for what happened when the deception became desire, when the lie became a life he actually wanted to live. Joy Ann would later tell FBI debriefers that even on that first night, she sensed something withheld in him, some part kept in reserve. She attributed it to trauma, to the displacement all refugees carried. She responded with patience, with tenderness, with the particularly American faith that love could heal what history had broken. In the morning, when she found him standing at the window studying the street below with an intensity that seemed excessive, she assumed he was watching for secret police, not making contact with his handler who stood at the tram stop, reading a newspaper with a chalk mark on the back page that meant, Phase 1 complete. Proceed to America. The voyage to New York took 11 days. Joy Ann spent them teaching Robert American expressions, the informal English that no textbook captured. He absorbed it all with an intensity she found flattering. When she corrected his pronunciation of baseball or explained why Americans said okay instead of yes, he took notes in a small leather journal he kept always in his breast pocket. She thought he was eager to assimilate. He was actually perfecting his cover. Washington in 1950 hummed with the peculiar energy of a capital that had just discovered it ruled half the world. Construction cranes dotted the skyline. Government offices spilled into temporary buildings left over from the war. Young couples from every state arrived daily, drawn by federal jobs and the promise of participating in history. Among them, the Balches appeared utterly unremarkable. Another immigrant success story in a city built on them. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment on Connecticut Avenue, close enough to DuPont Circle that Joy Ann could walk to the markets where diplomatic wives shopped. Robert found work immediately as a freelance translator, his services in demand from the growing constellation of European embassies. His Czech background provided perfect cover. Naturally, he spoke Russian, German, Czech, and Polish. Natural for a Sudeten refugee. Less natural for a Soviet illegal who'd memorized street maps of Washington while training in Moscow. Joy Ann decorated their apartment with aggressive Americana, Norman Rockwell prints, a needlepoint sampler reading, "God bless this home." She threw herself into citizenship classes at the local library, dragging Robert to every session. He played the eager student, stumbling charmingly over the Pledge of Allegiance, asking earnest questions about the Electoral College. The other immigrants found him endearing. The teacher, a widow whose son had died in Normandy, gave him extra attention, moved by what she saw as his desperate desire to become American. At night, while Joy Ann slept, Victor transmitted his first reports to Moscow using a shortwave radio concealed inside their kitchen radio. The messages were brief, coded in groups of 5 numbers that meant nothing unless you had the one-time pad hidden inside a hollowed-out Czech Bible. His early intelligence was modest, which embassy staffers drank too much, which congressional aides complained about their bosses, the mood in grocery stores as news from Korea worsened. Moscow Center responded with patience. Good illegals, they knew, were like wine. They improved with age. The real breakthrough came through church. Joy Ann insisted they attend services. It's what Americans did. They chose Metropolitan Methodist, 6 blocks from the White House, where government families worshipped alongside diplomats and military officers. Joy Ann joined the choir. Robert volunteered to help with the church's refugee assistance program, translating for displaced persons from Eastern Europe. It was there, in the church basement sorting donated clothes, that he met James Morrison. Morrison worked in the White House Communications Agency, the unit responsible for ensuring the president could communicate securely from anywhere in the world. He was 35, married, 2 children, and desperately lonely in the way of men who'd achieved professional success at the cost of personal connection. His wife attended church, but he usually worked. Sundays. This particular Sunday in March 1952, he'd come to donate his dead father's clothes and found Robert helping an elderly Czech couple fill out immigration forms. They struck up a conversation about chess. Morrison noticed Robert replacing pieces on a board some teenagers had abandoned. Within a month, they had a standing Thursday night game at Morrison's house in Alexandria. Morrison's wife, grateful that her husband had found a friend who might lighten his increasingly dark moods, welcomed the Balches warmly. Victor never asked Morrison about his work. Never had to. Lonely men, he'd been taught in Moscow, will eventually tell you everything if you simply listen without judgment. Over chess and beer, Morrison gradually painted a picture of the White House's communication vulnerabilities, the personality conflicts among Eisenhower's staff, the secret tensions between state and defense that newspapers never reported. He thought he was venting to a friend. He was actually providing Moscow with a window into American decision-making at the highest levels. Meanwhile, Joy Ann was constructing her own network without realizing it. The church women trusted her completely. This sweet Midwestern girl who'd saved her husband from communism. At their weekly coffee meetings, while their children played, these women talked. The Pentagon secretary mentioned her boss hadn't been home in 3 days. The State Department wife revealed her husband was learning Korean. The admiral's widow confided that her son's submarine deployment had been extended suddenly. Each fragment meant nothing alone. Together they formed a mosaic that helped Moscow understand American intentions in ways no satellite photo could reveal. The pregnancy in 1953 wasn't planned, at least not by Moscow. Victor had been trained to avoid children. They complicated missions, created vulnerabilities. But when Joy Ann told him, tears of joy streaming down her face, he found himself overwhelmed by an emotion his handlers hadn't programmed: genuine happiness. For a moment, standing in their small kitchen, he forgot he was anyone but Robert Balch, Czech refugee about to become an American father. That night, he almost confessed everything, almost told her to pack immediately, that they would run to Mexico, disappear, start over with identities neither American nor Soviet. But then the shortwave radio clicked on automatically at midnight. Moscow's signal that they were watching, always watching. He remembered the photographs they had of his real family in Leningrad, insurance against exactly this kind of sentimental weakness. The man at their door at 2 a.m. looked like he'd been assembled from shadow and smoke. August 1953, Washington humid as a greenhouse. Joy Ann, 7 months pregnant and unable to sleep even before the knocking started. She watched her husband's face in the hallway light and saw something she'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition. This visitor wasn't unexpected. He was inevitable. They spoke in Russian, not the careful accented Russian Robert used when translating at the embassy, but something faster, more natural, the Russian of someone who'd learned it in childhood. Joy Ann understood fragments. She'd been studying Czech, and the languages shared enough DNA that certain words emerged from the blur. Moscow, report, activation, and one word that needed no translation, a name that made her husband's shoulders tense. Stalin. The visitor stayed 3 minutes. When he left, Robert stood in their doorway like a man calculating the exact distance to the horizon. Joyanne waited. The baby kicked. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor's radio played Perry Como. The moment stretched until she thought it might snap. "Sit down," Robert finally said. Not his usual voice. This voice had angles she'd never heard, edges that could cut. The story came in pieces, each one harder than the last. His name wasn't Robert. He wasn't from Czechoslovakia. He hadn't fled the communists. He served them, had served them since before they met. Their entire marriage, their life, their coming child, all of it built on a foundation that had never existed. The refugee story, the persecution, your family's escape, none of it was real? My feelings for you are real. He said it quickly, desperately. That was never the assignment. You were supposed to be cover. Just cover. But Joyanne, I swear to you, what happened between us? Stop. She held up her hand. The wedding ring caught the lamplight. His grandmother's ring, he'd said. Another lie. Everything was a lie except, and this was the terrible part, except the way he looked at her now, which was exactly how he'd always looked at her. The love was real. It was everything else that was performance. She should have screamed, should have run to the neighbors, called the police, done what any patriotic American would do. Instead, she sat in their small kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, 7 months pregnant with a Soviet spy's child, and tried to understand how truth and deception could occupy the same space, the same marriage, the same heart. The man who was just here, she said slowly. He's your real boss. My handler, Vladimir Fedorov, he's been in Washington since 1947. And our friends, the Morrisons? Robert's silence was answer enough. My God, James and his work at the White House. You've been using him. I've been listening to him. There's a difference. Is there? Is there really? The baby kicked again, harder. Joyanne placed both hands on her belly. This child who would be born into a world of shadows, whether she chose it or not. She thought of her parents in Indiana, still believing their daughter had married a Czech refugee. She thought of the church women who trusted her, the citizenship teacher who'd given Robert extra help, all the people they'd deceived simply by existing in their presence. I could turn you in right now, she said. Yes, they'd arrest you, probably execute you. Eventually, yes. And me? What would happen to me? For the first time since the visitor left, Robert looked genuinely tormented. They might believe you didn't know. Probably would. American intelligence doesn't like to believe American women could choose this. But you'd be investigated for years. Every friend, every conversation, every moment of our life together examined. The baby would be born under surveillance, raised under suspicion, forever marked as the child of a Soviet spy. Joyanne understood then the cage she was in. Not just Robert's cage, hers now too. To expose him was to destroy not just their life, but any life their child might have. To stay silent was to become complicit in treason. There was no door marked innocent she could walk through. What does Moscow want? She asked. For now, nothing changes. I continue reporting. We maintain our cover. And if I refuse? If I take our child and leave? They have my family in Leningrad. My real family. Mother, sister, 2 nephews. And now, he gestured at her belly, they have mine here too. That's when Joyanne understood the full architecture of the trap. Moscow hadn't just caught Robert. They'd caught her too, using the oldest leverage in the world, love and its consequences. Every move toward freedom would hurt someone she cared about. Every step toward truth would punish the innocent. She stood up slowly, heavily, one hand supporting her back. At the sink, she filled a glass with water, drank it carefully, then turned to face the stranger she'd married. When the baby comes, she said, we tell no one. Not Moscow, not your handler. No one uses our child. That's my price for silence. Robert nodded quickly, too quickly, and she knew even this promise was just another negotiation with shadows, another deal that could be altered by people she'd never meet in places she'd never see. Nina Balch was born on October 3rd, 1953, at Georgetown University Hospital, her first cry echoing down corridors where senators' wives and diplomats' daughters gave birth to America's future. The nurse who handed her to Joy-Ann commented on the baby's alert eyes. "So watchful," she said, as if already studying the world she'd entered. Neither parent mentioned that vigilance might be inherited, that watching was the family business. By 1957, the Balches had achieved something remarkable. They'd become invisible through visibility. Their house in Bethesda, a 3-bedroom colonial with black shutters and a perfect lawn, sat on a street where Defense Department analysts lived next to congressional aides. Robert's translation business had incorporated, with legitimate contracts from the Belgian, Dutch, and Swedish embassies. Joy-Ann led the church choir and had been elected to the PTA board at Nina's elementary school. They were so thoroughly American that being foreign-born had become their only interesting characteristic. The intelligence they gathered had evolved, too. Through James Morrison's increasingly desperate confessions over chess, Robert mapped the fractures in Eisenhower's administration, which generals the president trusted, which advisors had his ear, how decisions really got made in the Oval Office. Morrison never revealed classified information, never broke his oath. He didn't have to. His complaints about working late, his pride when his unit handled presidential communications smoothly, his frustration when state and defense contradicted each other, all painted a picture Moscow couldn't obtain through any satellite. Thursday afternoons became Joy-Ann's operational hours. While Nina attended ballet class at Miss Prescott's Academy in Georgetown, Joy-Ann executed dead drops with suburban efficiency. A chalk mark on a fire hydrant meant check location Alpha, a hollow brick behind the French restaurant on Wisconsin Avenue. A blue thumbtack on a specific telephone pole meant emergency protocols. She'd developed a system of grocery shopping that took her past 6 potential drop sites, any of which could be serviced without deviation from a housewife's normal routine. The intelligence flowed both ways. Moscow provided context that helped Robert ask better questions, pursue more valuable connections. When they wanted information about NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, Robert volunteered to translate at a conference on European economic integration. The Belgian trade attaché, grateful for Robert's flawless French, invited him to embassy parties where military attachés drank too much and talked too freely. But it was Nina who became their greatest asset and their deepest vulnerability. At 7, she was bright, observant, and absolutely convinced her parents were heroes who'd escaped communist oppression. She told this story at school with such conviction that her 2nd-grade teacher invited Robert to speak to the class about life behind the Iron Curtain. He accepted, delivering a presentation so moving that the principal asked him to repeat it for the entire school. Standing at that podium telling 300 American children about the evils of Soviet communism, Victor felt the vertigo of his own deception. Every word he spoke was true. The oppression, the fear, the suffocating control. He knew because he enforced it. He was warning these children against himself. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 transformed their intelligence from valuable to vital. Washington's panic was palpable. Neighbors built bomb shelters. Nina's school practiced hiding under desks. Grocery stores ran out of canned goods. Through their network of unwitting sources, the Balches provided Moscow with something precious, the emotional temperature of American decision-making. A Pentagon secretary at church mentioned her boss had been sleeping in his office for 5 days. Morrison revealed the White House Communications Agency was testing backup systems in case Washington was destroyed. The wife of a Strategic Air Command liaison officer said her husband had missed their anniversary dinner. The first time in 12 years. Each detail helped Moscow calibrate their responses, understanding not just what America might do, but how close it was to doing it. On October 24th, at the height of the crisis, Joy-Ann stood in her kitchen listening to Kennedy's speech on the radio while encoding a message for Moscow. Nina was upstairs doing homework. Robert was at an emergency translation session at the Dutch embassy. The message was simple. Washington terrified but not paralyzed. Military wants strikes. President resisting. Population expects war, but hopes for peace. She finished encoding just as Nina came downstairs for milk and cookies. They sat together at the kitchen table, mother and daughter, while the world balanced on the edge of nuclear war. Nina asked if the Russians were really going to bomb them. Joy-Ann pulled her close, smelling her strawberry shampoo, feeling the weight of her small body, this American child who didn't know her parents were the Russians everyone feared. "No, sweetheart," Joy-Ann said. "Sometimes countries are like kids on a playground. They act tough, but nobody really wants to fight." "But Daddy said the communists are evil." Joy-Ann hesitated. Robert's anti-communist performances had become so convincing that even she sometimes forgot they were acting. "People aren't evil, Nina. Systems can be evil. Governments can be evil. But people are just people, trying to protect their families." Nina seemed satisfied with this answer. She went back upstairs to finish her homework, a report on what makes America special. Joy-Ann returned to her encoding, preparing intelligence for a government her daughter was being taught to fear, protecting a family that existed only because of deception. September 1964. Nina found the Canadian passport on a Thursday afternoon when everyone believed she was at ballet. She'd felt feverish that morning but hadn't told her mother. If you missed 2 classes at Miss Prescott's, you lost your spot in the winter recital. So Joy-Ann dropped her off as usual, and Nina slipped out the back door, walking home through Georgetown's tree-lined streets. The house was silent in that particular way of empty homes, where even the furniture seems to exhale. Nina went to her parents' room looking for aspirin. The medicine cabinet yielded nothing, so she tried her father's dresser, where he sometimes kept headache powder. Instead, behind his rolled socks, her fingers found leather. A passport. But wrong somehow. Canadian. Her father's photo stared back at her, but the name read David Kellner. Children know their parents' faces better than anyone. Nina had studied her father's face for 11 years. While he read her bedtime stories, helped with homework, taught her chess, but this photograph showed something she'd never seen. Her father, without his American mask. The camera had caught him between identities, neither Robert nor Victor, just a tired man carrying too many names. She kept searching, driven by the sick certainty that comes when you realize everything might be wrong. In the attic, inside a hollowed-out Czech dictionary, she found the radio frequencies. Numbers, times, dates. A child who'd grown up during the Cuban Missile Crisis knew what communication protocols looked like. Her father had taught her himself, explaining how America stayed safe through vigilance. When her parents returned from their PTA meeting that evening, Nina was sitting at the kitchen table with the evidence spread before her like a tarot reading of their real life. Joy-Ann dropped her purse. Robert went completely still, the way he'd gone still that night in 1953 when Fedorov knocked. "Nina, sweetheart, let us explain." "You're Russian spies." She said it flatly. Not a question. 11 years old, fever bright, understanding everything and nothing simultaneously. "You're the people we're supposed to be afraid of." The conversation that followed broke all 3 of them in different ways. Robert tried logic, explaining geopolitics to a child who just wanted her parents to be who they'd always claimed. Joy-Ann tried emotion, insisting their love for her was real, even if everything else was performance. Nina listened with the terrible comprehension of a bright child forced to grow up in a single moment. "Do you tell them about my school? My friends? Do you tell Russia about my life?" "Never," Joy-Ann said quickly. "Never about you." But Nina saw the look that passed between her parents. Everything was intelligence. Everything was useful. Even an 11-year-old's birthday party guest list could reveal whose parents worked where, who had security clearances, who might be vulnerable to approach in 5 or 10 years. When Nina's friends grew up to run the country their parents currently served, they made her complicit that night, showed her just enough truth to ensure her silence, that exposure meant her father's execution, her mother's imprisonment, her own future destroyed. They taught her to lie by explaining the cost of truth. Within a week, Nina was performing her own role, the normal American daughter of normal immigrant parents. But she performed it with the hypervigilance of someone who knew the audience included the FBI. The next 5 years twisted them all into shapes they couldn't recognize. Robert developed angina, his heart literally failing under the pressure of deception. Joy-Ann's Valium prescription increased quarterly. Nina dated the captain of the debate team, then the student body president, then, in what seemed like deliberate provocation, the son of an FBI field agent named Marcus Webb. Marcus was everything Nina should have been if her life were real. Uncomplicated, patriotic, confident in the clarity of American righteousness. His father worked in counterintelligence. Sunday dinners at the Webb house were torture, Nina sitting across from a man who spent his weeks hunting people like her parents, while her parents sat home wondering if their daughter was compromised or compromising them. By 1968, the Bulches were drowning in their own success. Robert's translation business had expanded to include defense contractors needing technical manuals translated. Joy-Ann had been elected to the church board, where she helped oversee charity distributions to refugee families, some of whom were genuine, some of whom were Soviet illegals like themselves, though they never knew which. They'd achieved perfect cover at the cost of perfect isolation. Trusted by everyone, unable to trust anyone. Vladimir Fedorov's defection in September 1968 reached them through a dead drop that had been dormant for 3 years. The message was 4 words. Fedorov burned. Prepare extraction. Robert destroyed the passport Nina had found 4 years earlier, along with 2 others she hadn't. Joy-Ann emptied their accounts gradually, claiming home repairs. They obtained new Canadian documents through a GRU forger in Montreal, driving up separately, telling Nina they were visiting colleges. The escape route was memorized. Drive to Buffalo, cross at Rainbow Bridge, fly from Toronto to Vienna, then disappear into the Soviet Union or whatever neutral country would have them. But they couldn't leave. Nina had been accepted early to Georgetown. She had a boyfriend, a future, a life that was real, even if theirs wasn't. Every night, they packed mental suitcases. Every morning, they unpacked them and continued the performance. They were trapped not by walls or guards, but by love. The one thing Moscow hadn't calculated. The one vulnerability no intelligence service could eliminate.